something like that.
So Lyle, there's a huge difference. I completely agree with you. But
Yeah,
there's a huge difference between intention and expectation,
sure.
right? So I think that when we talk about the flow state, there must absolutely be complete intention, one-pointed intention. All of your intention is to be something. And this is where things like even my language is going to start to fall apart. But like intention and expectation are two different things, because intention is about what you're putting into it. Expectation is about what you hope to get out of it.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So I think when you try too hard to be the therapy gecko, you will not actually be the therapy gecko. What I would say is when you let yourself become the therapy gecko, you will be the best therapy gecko. You have to let it take you for a ride. You can't, turn on the engine and just go and tell it where to go.
Yeah.
You got to let it take you. What do you think about that?
I like that. I think that makes a lot of sense. Letting that's fun. That is like meditation, where like if you sit down and you're like, I'm going to become the one with the worlds or whatever, it doesn't work. But if you sort of let it happen, I'm thinking about like last night's stream, like because I felt like I was very much in the flow state and acting, presenting myself in the way that I wanted to, and yeah, I would say that's pretty accurate.
So I think even if you go back to the early part of our stream today and you talk about, what it's like when I use the word channel, and you started using these words like you were being and alive, like maybe that was my word, but the way you were kind of describing it is like, there's sometimes some of the yogis and Zen masters and stuff will describe it as a flowering. So the reason I think they use the word flowering is because you can't like make a flower bloom. Like you can't, like if there's a bud, like you can't peel it apart and like turn it into a flower. It's something that you have to let happen, right? So it's not something you can do, but it's something you have to let happen. And this is a concept that I think is very, very like lost in our society today, because we're all about like metrics and performance and like living up to expectations and having job descriptions and like, what's your KPI? Like how many views are you getting? How many subs are you getting? We're all like outcome oriented. So we've forgotten sort of as a society how to let things bloom, right? How to set everything up, how to, start making content on the internet at 10, but you didn't care about your views and stuff. I mean, maybe you did, but you're focused on making content and doing stand up. And then like, as all of these factors kind of go together, as you water the plant, as you give it sunlight, as you give it the right kind of soil and fertilizer, eventually something grows, and it takes a decade, and then you see a flowering. It's a happening. And so what I'd kind of say is that when you talk about the flow state, this is sort of the last concept that I'll share, is there's this idea in yoga and in meditation that we each have within us a piece of divinity. And that gets kind of confusing because people are like, what does that mean? Like, does that mean I can move mountain? What does that mean? People don't know what divinity is. And so I'd say, like, instead of trying to understand divinity from kind of like a logical way or abstract way, there's something within you that once you channel it, like everything is just good, baby. It's like you feel alive, you produce better content, you feel happier, right? It's not like an abstract because you've got the chair. It's like an experience of happiness. And it's not even like happiness like you're laughing. It's not even emotional, right? Because that's the other thing that confuses people about the word happiness, is they correlate happiness with positive emotion. But in the flow state, what it really is when you're channeling that divinity, that's when you produce work, right? So like, I think it was the Greeks that talked about genius is something that like strikes you, right? So it's like this thing that is not something, you aren't a genius, you channel genius. And so genius is like a state of mind as opposed to a person. And so this state of flow like makes you feel happy, makes you feel alive, not on an emotional level, not in I've got my big chair level, but in that moment you feel present. You're not thinking about the future. You're not thinking about where things are going. You're not thinking about metrics. You're not worried about whether you're doing a good job or bad job. And so what I really call that, I think like you've got a taste of that, which is like what they use the word divinity because they couldn't come up with what that is, right? So they said that, each of us has this spark of the divine, because if you look in You look in that moment, you're OP, right? You're performing well, you're happier, you're like doing a fantastic job, and that sounds OP. So what we're going to call that is the divine. And then they also went through a series of like different practices and stuff to cultivate that state, to spend more time in that state, to advance beyond that state into other states. And then eventually you get to something that they called moksha, or enlightenment, which has all of the features of the crap that you've already been describing, like loss of ego and other things like that, which I know you said you couldn't explain, but I think you did a very good job of, because I think you actually understand it, because it sounds like you've lived it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's my spiel.
Interesting. This is making me like when people say that like you know, God told them to paint a picture or something. Maybe that's their interpretation of that or something. It makes a lot of sense.
Interesting thing there is, I'm not so sure that that's the case, because there's a great book by a guy named William James called The Varieties of Religious Experience. And some artists were like mentally ill or possibly psychotic. Or maybe they had a spiritual experience, like through prayer. It's interesting. Sure. But what I do find is that especially with like the creative, like people who I work with who make music and write and things like that, that they really have to, like, the more they can cultivate that channeling of divinity, the more they sort of almost accept that I can't control it. Because a big part of like creative folks is that they set themselves up with the expectation of today I have to write like a blockbuster piece of music. And if they that expectation will paralyze them. Whereas if they go back, because their first blockbuster came without any expectation of being a blockbuster, and they made music for the sake of fucking making music, you know, and that's what made it a blockbuster. And then they try to make a blockbuster, and then sometimes they succeed because it's procedurally generated, you know, highly processed, kind of algorithmically driven stuff. It's like Netflix is just adding a sprinkling of a homosexual sex scene somewhere in all of their shows. You know, so sometimes it's driven like that, but then you have like, you know, the real artistry behind certain shows where people are like, they're not trying to make a blockbuster. They're just trying to tell a story or trying to, you know, really make something genuine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That all makes perfect sense.